观众朋友们好，现在是美国东部时间5月18日，这里是华尔街网报当时第1期节目。现在我们继续为您带来有关中国以及世界的最新消息。在现在的这一段视频中，您看到的是5月16日上海解封之后，在虹桥国际机场外排队的人流数。根据来自新华社的报道，上海铁路警方又说，近期出现一些不法人员通过网络抢票手段加价倒卖离沪火车票，而上海铁路警方组织多支警力开展集中打击。现在警方查处倒卖火车票案件5起，抓获犯罪嫌疑人6位，均被采取刑事强制措施。报道表示，现在离沪人员大为增加，有不法人员趁机高价倒卖车票谋取暴利。铁路警方又说，现在对于这种违法犯罪行为要采取零容忍和严打高压态势，以此维护旅客权益。
然后还有就是挂软件，这是可以说的吗？
可以，我们这什么都报道，真实的情况就报道。
好的，就是还有一个软件叫智行飞机票，它上面是可以就是帮你抢票的，什么你就是需要在上面登录12306的账号就可以了。然后我们第一次是没有抢到的。哦，黄牛这是可以说的吗？
可以啊，新闻就是什么都应该要报道，只要是真实的事情。
就是还有找一个黄牛，但是。
再为您关注到的是来自联合早报的有关消息。中共中央办公厅近日印发了关于加强离退休干部党员建设工作的意见，其中说要求离退休干部党员严守纪律，不得妄议党中央大政方针，不得传播政治性负面言论。联合早报分析指出，在中国国内疫情冲击、外部环境恶化的情况下，有一些离退休干部脱离日常党组织活动后，附和某些社会舆论，私下里通过互联网平台发牢骚、讲怪话，甚至公开质疑官方内外政策，成为政治性负面言论的传播者，在党内外造成不良影响。分析说，高层要求加强对于离退休干部党员的建设，就是要增强离退休干部党员的党性观念和党纪意识，不能让体制内的杂音与某些社会舆论形成声势，损害中央权威和集中领导。联合早报文章回顾，在2015年，当时中纪委颁布了新的纪律处分条例，增加了妄议中央大政方针的提法。此后，在官方通报的落马高官中，不少人都犯了妄议中央大政方针的所谓错误，比如辽宁省委前书记王民、天津省委前代理书记黄兴国、甘肃省委前书记王三运等。中纪委说，妄议中央大政方针的高官往往是当面不讲，背后乱讲，会上不讲，会后乱讲，台上不讲，台下乱讲。联合早报还分析，近期有一些曾经身居高位的离退休干部被立案调查，比如退休3年的大连市公安局原局长刘乐国在昨天被查，现在大连公安局已经连续3任局长被查，辽宁公安厅3任厅长也相继被查，而且大多都是在离任后被调查。联合早报分析，退休后落马的官员主要是因为任内涉嫌腐败，但是也有人在退休后捞钱，并犯有妄议中央、传播政治性负面言论的错误，也就是所谓的在任时不讲，卸任后乱讲。联合早报分析，有一些离退休干部，特别是担任过领导职务的干部，脱离组织约束后，言论尺度过大，在社会上造成不好影响，因此官方出台这样的意见，就是要把他们置于监督之下。再为您关注到的是经济方面的消息。根据来自彭博社的报道，法国外贸银行周三发布报告，表示中国长期防疫风控造成经济活动低迷，将导致中国今年 GDP 增速预估无法达到目标。报告表示，随着风控措施导致中国生产中断，消费需求受到负面影响，新加坡可能会受到严重冲击。 法国外贸银行经济学家分析表示，中国对于新加坡虽然直接影响不大，但是由于新加坡是大宗商品枢纽，而鉴于中国在大宗商品进口中的地位，新加坡会受到间接中国需求转弱的影响。特别是由于对中国游客的依赖，整个东南亚地区的经济也面临风险，其中以泰国尤甚。而印度经济增长可能会受到提振，原因是中国需求会打压全球大宗商品价格，改善印度外部贸易条件。分析指出，在货币方面，澳元在亚太地区贬值幅度最大。澳大利亚受到中国需求变化的影响，而澳大利亚向中国出口铁矿石等原材料。法国外贸银行把中国今年 GDP 增速预估从 5.2% 下调至 4.2%， 认为大规模的风控可能会拉低 GDP 增速 1.5个百分点。如果现行的风控延长更长时间，对于经济的打击则更为明显。同时，高盛也将中国2022年全年 GDP 预估从 4.5% 下调至 4%， 第二季度的 GDP 年率预测则从 4% 下调至 1.5%。高盛表示，这样的预测包含的假设是，未来相当长的一段时间内，疫情不会出现严重反弹，基本可以得到控制，房地产市场外部环境有所改善，而政府可能会通过基建来实施补偿性措施。与此同时，北京再次宣布疫情封控升级，对丰台区提及管控，全区非必要不出区，实施居家办公。因为在此前，丰台区又发现了社会面感染案例。
I think WeChat's actually a good model. If you're in China, it's basically, you kind of live on WeChat. It does everything. It's sort of like Twitter plus PayPal plus a whole bunch of other things, and all roll into one with actually a great interface, and it's really an excellent app. And we don't have anything like that outside of China. I think such an app would be really useful. Just like the utility of it, of sort of a spam-free thing where you can make comments, you can post videos, you can, I think it's important for content creators to have a revenue share. Now, this does not need to be done on Twitter. It could be done from something that's created from scratch. So it could be something new. So really, but I think this thing needs to exist, whether it is converting Twitter to be the sort of like.
Rest assured, if Putin continues his heinous war of choice, the Biden administration will work with you and our other partners to push Russia further towards economic, financial, and strategic isolation. More and more, the Kremlin will be forced to choose between propping up its economy and funding the continuation of Putin's brutal war. Now, we need to extend our cooperation to boosting support for Ukraine. Ukraine's immediate financing needs are significant. Due to the ingenuity and bravery of Ukrainian officials, their government continues to function. But in the months until tax collection can resume at pace, Ukraine needs budget funding to pay soldiers, employees, and pensioners, as well as to operate an economy that meets its citizens' basic needs. Motivated by any one country's foreign policy or economic objectives. Rather, we're acting to uphold principles. There is a strong case for pursuing common goals jointly, not unilaterally. For example, we have a common interest in incentivizing China to refrain from economic practices that have disadvantaged all of us. These practices range from those affecting trade and investment to development and climate policies, to approaches to provide debt relief to countries facing unsustainable debt burdens. Where we share common interests, we should all find ways to engage with China and express our views. And China is more likely to respond favorably if it cannot play one of us off against the other.
you so much. Thank you very much to Secretary Yellen there, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, kicking off the Brussels.
In a new book, Dancing on Bones, veteran journalist and author Katie Stallard examines ways in which leaders of China, Russia, and North Korea manipulate the past to secure their grips on power. Joining me today is author of the book, Katie. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you for having me. It's great to join you.
Right, so Katie, I wanted to start with the title of the book, Dancing on Bones. I wonder if you can tell me a little more about the meaning of the title.
Yeah, so this is a quote actually from a Russian activist who, together with a few friends in 2013, decided that he would set up his own memorial movement. He was unhappy with the way that the memory of the war, what is known in the West as World War II or the Second World War, was known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. He felt that the state commemorations had become too bombastic, too militaristic, that the real people and the real lives that the war had taken had been lost. So he and his friends started this procession that they called the Immortal Regiment, where they would just march quietly holding photos of their relatives and of ancestors who had died in the war. The movement became incredibly popular. Suddenly tens of thousands of people across Russia wanted to take part. So the authorities inevitably co-opted it, worked it into their own rival movement. And it's now this, enormous annual event that Vladimir Putin takes part in. He marches at the front with a photo of his own father in these processions every year. So this was this man's view of what had happened was that the authorities were now dancing on bones, was his word. He felt that they were really exploiting the memory of this war for their own political purposes.
When I read the book, it really draws from your firsthand reporting on the ground in North Korea, Russia, and China. And I keep returning to the quote from 1984, who controls the past controls the future, which is sort of the central tenet of the book. In a few sentences, why do dictators in these countries relentlessly erase, distort, and co-opt the country's history?
Well, the short answer is that because it works. It is a terribly effective way to appeal to your population to be able to draw on these national myths and to be able to use this quite distorted, often, memory of the past for your contemporary political purposes. And I should say, I write this in the book too, that the impulse to do this isn't unique to autocrats. We're talking here in the United States, and I think we can all think of people who've tried to use the American history for their own purposes. So the impulse to do it isn't unique to autocrats. But I think what's particularly interesting in these three cases is really what happens once you strip out all alternative versions of history, and when you really then only have the official version of history, and it becomes very dangerous to try to push back against that and to try to tell a different story about the past.
In the book, you write about the Chinese Communist Party's renewed campaign against the so-called historical nihilism. Putin's war messaging is eerily similar, this idea that our country has made the greatest sacrifice to save the world from the Nazis, and we deserve respect from the West. How concerned should we be that Xi Jinping or some other future Chinese leader will weaponize China's history to justify war in the future, perhaps against Taiwan?
Yeah, I think we should be very concerned, and we should understand that in such an event, this is how that would be explained to the domestic population. As Putin is doing now, the case that the leader would make is that they are doing this to defend China's security, and that they're doing that to reclaim land that the Chinese Communist Party insists is rightfully Chinese and was taken from China as part of the century of humiliation that the Chinese Communist Party focuses on very heavily in its current messaging. But I think this is not just a factor in a potential and probably quite unlikely physical war. I think it's important to understand that this is also how all sorts of contemporary issues are being framed, like the territorial disputes, and even just the need for the Communist Party to be in power at all, the intensifying rivalry with the United States. This is being framed by the Communist Party for its domestic audience through the prism of this past history and the past suffering that the country has experienced.
I want to turn to this document, the third historical resolution, which was passed last year. You also write about this document in a book. So tell us, what's the significance of that document? Why is Xi Jinping so fixated on sort of presenting the correct version of the history? And how does Xi Jinping position himself in that version of the history?
I think we've really seen since Xi Jinping came to power this real top-level focus on history. He was really explicit from the early weeks of being in power how important it was to take a firm grip on the past and the danger that what he calls historical nihilism could pose. And I think this historical resolution we really see as the end result of that campaign, this idea that you need to take a firm hold of the past and you need to make sure that the official narrative is agreed upon. So I think what you see in the historical resolution is the Communist Party's version of history. And it's interesting and fascinating to read because it helps you to understand, this is the version of history that young people are going to grow up learning there. This is the version of history that officials need to refer to. And when you read that version of history, the moral of that story is always that, and therefore the Communist Party needs to be in power. I mean, Xi Jinping talks explicitly in his speech around the 100th anniversary, and it's there in the text of the history resolution, that the Chinese Communist Party is the foundation and the lifeblood on which China's future depends. So the argument of that document and the endpoint of the Chinese Communist Party's version of history is that when you look back at the past, you understand why the Communist Party needs to be in power, and therefore why anyone who disagrees with that mustn't be a patriot. It's unpatriotic, or it's something that a traitor would do, is to suggest the opposite. So that history is really being used to serve the party's purposes now and to make the case as to why they believe they must be in power.
Right. And in the book, you also talk about how this operation of manipulating history is sort of like a disinformation war on the domestic audience. Do we have evidence of the effect of such historical narrative on the domestic audience? I mean, in the Russian case, we see that Russians seem to, or at least the majority of Russians seem to have accepted Putin's justification for war. Some may even be rallying support behind Putin. If anything, the Chinese media environment is more restrictive than Russia's. And we don't have transparent, public polling data telling us the truth. But to what extent has the official narrative convinced the public based on your, firsthand on the ground reporting and your source?
I mean, it's very difficult to measure through polling in China for the reasons that you outline. Certainly, I can tell you from some of the reporting I did for the book, for instance, talking to high school students about what they were learning about the Second World War's history and how they interpreted that. They all told me that they felt very strongly, having heard about, having read about, having studied how China had suffered in the past, they all made this link to, therefore, we must be strong now. It's really important that China is never weak again, and therefore it can never be made to suffer like it did in the past. But I think, beyond those firsthand and the sort of anecdotal experience, Russia, where we can measure this to a greater extent, I will be honest that I was surprised at how well this narrative has held up there. I did wonder whether once Russian casualties started to be sustained in really large numbers, once the economy started to suffer, I wondered how much support there would be for this historical narrative and for the case that Putin makes that this is a new war, like the great and noble war that they fought in the Great Patriotic War. But the evidence so far there suggests that it is holding up, that it is being persuasive to citizens who are hearing the Kremlin's line, and that is resulting in support for the war.
Right, and although the targeted audience of that narrative is domestic, but the effect, the externality definitely goes beyond the border of the country. To, U.S. policymakers or to people in the West, what can we do in order to stop that narrative from becoming, sort of a realized kind of danger to the world?
I mean, I think one of the things, and part of why I embarked on the book was just to try and flesh out a more nuanced picture of what is the story that the leaders of these countries tell their people. What is the case they make for the moves that they're making? So I think firstly, understanding that and not playing into those narratives. But I think secondly, doing everything that can be done in countries like this in the United States to make it possible for scholars, for historians, for ordinary citizens from these countries to come here, to study freely, to learn anything they like about their country's history, and to bring their expertise, their interviews, their firsthand experiences here. I think what is really unhelpful is some of what we see now with, the rivalry between the United States and China resulting in a difficult environment for Chinese citizens, Chinese students, Chinese scholars to come here. That's the opposite of what the United States should be doing. They should be making it as easy and as welcoming as possible for brilliant young scholars, to come here and to pursue their work here in the United States.